So I do appreciate your stamina. It's been a wonderful afternoon, wonderful morning and afternoon. 12 really spectacular talks about various aspects of the future of Williams. And I think more than 12 individual talks, a conversation that they all add up to about where we're heading and these dimensions that are so important of who we're going to be and how and what we're going to learn and what difference we're going to make. So that's been today. Last night, we had an equally interesting conversation about Jack Sawyer and about the most transformative period in the 20th century of Williams' history, 1961 to 1973, during which, under Jack Sawyer's leadership, the college moved away from the fraternity system, admitted women on the full same basis as men, diversified the student body, and deeply changed and diversified the curriculum. So those were two conversations, one about the future and one about the past. So what I'm going to try to do now is bring them together, to try to bring Jack Sawyer himself into conversation with our own future. And we have an opportunity to do that because of a remarkable artifact that we managed to find in the archives. In 1964, Hughes Rudd from CBS News, in a program called One of a Kind, came to Williamstown and spent a few days with Jack Sawyer and with Harry Ransom. Harry Ransom was the chancellor at the time of the University of Texas, a very different sort of institution, and had a conversation about higher education. And it's really a remarkable look back into the way people were thinking about higher education at that time. And I think for all of us, it's particularly exciting because it's a chance to see Jack Sawyer express himself in kind of long form on the issues of the day. And so what I'd like to do, and they sit in Sloan House and do it, and so that's of course a lot of fun for me because I get to look at the same furniture that's in there today. So here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to play some snips from that conversation between these college presidents and try to, in between those, offer some of my own reflections on the ways in which Jack Sawyer engages with a set of really critical questions. And then, particularly for all of us having sat through the reflections of today's 12 speakers, how does his reaction to that compare to how we think about those questions today? So without further ado, I'm going to cue Hughes Rudd.
One of a Kind, a series of informative broadcasts, a new anthology of sight and sound, form and technique.
It's deep winter now in northwestern Massachusetts. Skiing up here in the Berkshires will be good for another month. This is a winter paradise far away from the noise of cities, but in spite of its peaceful appearance, this isn't a retreat from the world. Young men come here for rigorous study as well as for recreation, for work as well as for play. Here in this valley lies Williamstown, the home of Williams College since 1793. Williams is a private college teaching the liberal arts to more than 1,100 men on 650 acres of New England hills. 3 days ago, we came here for a conversation between the president of Williams and the chancellor of the University of Texas on the problems facing colleges and universities today. The University of Texas, unlike Williams, is a coeducational school supported mainly by state funds. The campus at Austin has been open since 1883 and covers 1,100 acres. Texas has grown rapidly and has more than doubled its size since the end of World War II. Its faculty alone numbers 1,400, almost 300 more teachers than the whole student body at Williams. Here at Williams, the president lives in this house where we will meet the men who make the final decisions concerning two of this country's institutions of higher learning. I'm Hughes Rudd. This is the entrance hall of Sloan House, the traditional home of Williams College presidents. The house is 163 years old, built in the federal style. In the next room is John Sawyer, the president of Williams, and with him is Dr. Harry Ransom, the chancellor of the University of Texas. Dr. Ransom has flown in from Texas to be with us. The problems of the president of Williams and the chancellor of the University of Texas might seem vastly different, but essentially they're the same, the education of the young. How we should best go about higher education and what the purposes of such education are, these are problems faced by both men. Let's join Mr. Sawyer and Dr. Ransom in the living room.
So 1964. It's clearly a time when this country was thinking deeply about what higher education was, what purposes it was to serve, whether it was operating well, who was going to be served by it. And in that way, it's very much like the time that we're in now. One has to note some immediate differences, the first being that they actually thought that talking to some people who worked in higher education would be a great way of finding out about how to think about those problems. I commend that approach to today's media. The other thing that I think is nice about the way this is framed is that it's framed, although we're going to mostly listen to Jack Sawyer, it's framed as a conversation about all of higher education. And if you look at the entire video, there's a lot of conversation back and forth between Ransom and Sawyer about what's similar and what's different between the sector of liberal arts colleges educating a small number of students in a small place and the kind of thing that would happen at Texas educating tens of thousands of students. And again, one of the themes that emerges is that the problems are very similar, and many of the values that underlie education at Williams and at Texas turn out to be similar, much as I believe that those values are similar today. Another theme that we're going to see emerging in the conversation with Sawyer and the things Sawyer says is that while on the one hand, this is a time of daring change, and we've talked, I think, for a day now about what those daring changes were, we're also going to see that those changes were made for the purpose, at the same time, of preserving the heart of what Williams was, preserving the liberal arts ideal, keeping the liberal arts at the center of Williams' educational philosophy and educational commitments. And I think it's very gratifying to see that tension between change and enduring values play out in such a nuanced way in the conversation that we're going to be part of here. So to get us started on that, let me quote from something we found in the archives recently. This is from Jack Sawyer's Plans and Purposes statement in launching the 175th anniversary campaign in 1963. And he says, "America as a civilization will not perish from lack of specialized knowledge or specialized institutions. Its greatest need may rather be the development of men of larger understanding and of the qualities and judgment to assume its complex burdens. For this purpose, the first-class liberal arts college, itself a unique creation of the American scene, remains a notable and most promising institution. As I understand it, such is the central purpose to which Williams is dedicated." And I think that leads us to the central question, and the first question that I would invite Jack Sawyer to comment on, which is, what are we here for? And what is education?
And say that the case for the liberal arts core of undergraduate education is stronger now than ever before, on the simple premise that the rate of change, not only in technology but in institutions and much else, is such that no precise technical training can meet the circumstances of 10, 20, 30 years from now. We have to realize that, as you know, the students now entering our institutions are going to be carrying responsibilities well into the next century. And the kind of problems they're going to face, governmental, internal policies, administrative, science, simply cannot be foreseen. And the elasticity of the liberal arts type of education, awakening the capacity to see and understand and respond over as wide an arc as possible, is the kind of education that I feel very deeply is the most durable and in some sense the most practical training we can give men who are going to be carrying responsibilities over a world that's spinning as fast as this one.
A world that's spinning as fast as this one. The 1960s were not a simpler time than now. The civil rights movement, the assassination of Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, were in the past. The Cold War was in full swing. And ahead lay the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the Great Society program, which is an investigation into the relationship between our society and those who were the neediest in it, the space race. and the escalation of the Vietnam War and the conflict on the campuses that that was to bring. So it was a time of rapid change, and a time in which people who lived through then understood that. In fact, quite parallel to the time we live in now. If now we worry about the effects of global warming, which we certainly have to worry about, in 1964, we worried about the danger of nuclear apocalypse and the closeness of nuclear war, how close nuclear war may have felt. And if now we feel that technology is changing rapidly the way we experience the world, that also was no less true in 1964. And so that sense that institutions need to adapt to change, that we feel so intensely now that they need to adapt to change in a daring, bold way, was no less the case in 1964. And the fact that this is a black and white, grainy black and white image, and that the glasses are old-fashioned, shouldn't blind us to that fact. In fact, if you look at the students who were there in 1964 and ask what world did they live in, how did that world change for them, I think one has to admit that it changed far more than even Jack Sawyer could have foreseen, that he could never have foreseen so much of what we have now in 2013. My iPhone, which I've turned off, the entire revolution of internet information technology, the vast political changes in the world that were to come in the last 2 decades. And if you look at the students who were there in 1964 and ask what was it that they gained from their educations, and many of you are in this room today, what did you gain from your educations that made you effective over that 50 years between then and now, and made you effective in the world? What that you went through impacted you and allowed you to impact the world? It could not have been the facts that were poured into your head during Jack Sawyer's presidency. It had to have been, because the world changed so much, a set of larger capacities that Williams inculcated in the process of giving you that education. In fact, this is the case that Sawyer makes again and again in this video, that liberal arts education is the finest preparation for a career and for a life, and that it gets more appropriate and not less the more the world that we're living in is one that is undergoing rapid change.
One of the problems that I think we both are mindful of, and that American higher education has to be mindful of, is that the vocational demands of an increasingly complicated civilization don't press back into and cut away some essentials of the liberal arts program. That is, these are years, age 17 to 21, when young men and women who build into themselves a fair amount of the basic knowledge, tools of learning, have a chance to stand up and look around and look widely. Look at the arts and humanities, at history and the social sciences. Even if they're not going to be scientists, get an understanding of what science is about. And I think we have to mount the defenses to protect and preserve the range and variety and richness of the undergraduate years, to keep the liberal arts core, which has been its traditional strength, remaining at the heart of the enterprise.
Of course, Jack Sawyer makes these remarks because there was a debate going on then as now about what higher education really is for. And how do you measure the return, if you will, on the investment that we make in the higher education of 18 to 22-year-olds? And almost that language, return on investment, drives us in a direction which I think is deeply unproductive. That is, if we look for measures of the value of education, such as the salaries that our graduates make in their first jobs, or the number of them that go on to a particular professional school, business school, or the number that go on to law school, we're driven inexorably toward a vocational notion of what that experience in higher education is about. There's no question that an education has to prepare young people to be effective in the world, to make a living, to have a career. But that goes far beyond preparing young people for their first job. People's careers are 50 years long. We often say that we prepare you for your last job rather than your first job, but we prepare you for more than just your working career. What Sawyer does in this clip, and he does elsewhere in the interview, is defend the liberal arts education as a preparation for life, a preparation for all of the aspects of life that are important to us, not only how we make our money, not only what our careers are, and to argue strenuously against the impoverishing notion that higher education, that your time in college is about only your vocation and about only the initial aspects of your vocation is a critical element of the leadership that Sawyer showed, not only in this video and not only as president of Williams, but in fact in his career after Williams. You know, it's interesting, in a part of this clip that we don't show, they ask Harry Ransom the same question, and you might have imagined that working in a very different sector, having to educate 5, 10 times as many students, he might have a different view, that the role of his institution, the University of Texas, is to prepare students for their first job, and that the measure of the quality of what they're delivering at Texas might be the salaries of their graduates the day they walk out the door. But what Ransom says is actually quite the opposite. He says two things. One, that the purpose of education at Texas is as much these larger education in the liberal arts as it is at Williams. And second, that it is critical that institutions like Williams show leadership in making the case in this country for the value of that kind of education and for the valuing of that sort of education. Now, today we've had talks, among others, on how and what we are going to learn in the future. And they've been marvelous, and they've touched on many aspects of these. So I don't want to oversimplify them when I pull out two key themes, which I think ran through many of them. The first is the increasing importance of interdisciplinary approaches in the work that we do. And if you look at the Williams curriculum today, and you look at the people who participate in that curriculum, the faculty and the ways they're interested in teaching, the students and the ways they're interested in learning, throughout the sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, the arts, you see more and more interdisciplinary work, interdisciplinary programs, and interdisciplinary work within departments. This isn't as much about the structure of how we organize our academic departments and faculties as it is about the ways we think about the work that we do, whether it is leadership studies or Africana studies or neuroscience. That's a change, it's an accelerating change, and we're never going back on that. The other theme is the enduring importance of the breadth of that education. That speaker after speaker has made the point that for a scientist to learn some economics, or a political scientist to learn some math, or a physicist to learn some art, is not to decorate their real education with some nice things that will allow them to be good conversationalists at cocktail parties. It is to create a view of the world that is whole, that will allow them to do whatever work they do in a way that is deeply understanding of the context in which that work occurs. Now, this is no less true in a time of rapid technological change.
In educating these huge numbers of people, is educational television going to be much of a help? Or do you think that's too mechanical?
I think it will be a tremendous help in complementing the regular instruction, but that by mere electronic means we're going to solve such problems as we discussed earlier, recruitment of faculty and the encouragement of the sort of liberal education in particular that we were talking about. I can't believe that there lies any solution at all.
I feel inevitably we were going to move toward increasing use of audio-visual aids. Faculties are conservative, colleges are conservative, but clearly there are technical possibilities that are already visible in language instruction and art education and other things that will be extended rapidly. But I think Mr. Ransom has put his finger on an important point. We must not let ourselves be deluded into thinking that there can be endless mechanical substitutes for the essential human input. And this is what I feel is really most important of all, that we as a nation recognize the urgency of giving the financial support that higher education needs to do its job on the human side as well as on the facilities and technical.
So I'm going to pick my only bone with Jack Sawyer right now. I don't think our faculties are conservative at all about the use of technology. And I think if you look at the ways that we teach and the resources that this institution puts in to bringing new technologies into the classroom and giving our faculty the chance to experiment with new pedagogies that are enabled by those technologies, I think you'd find this is one of the most exciting moments ever in the history of this college for that. But I do think that there's an important point in here, which is that technology, certainly in my view, perhaps in Jack Sawyer's view as well, has primarily the opportunity to enhance what we do, not to make what we do here somehow obsolete and disrupt it in the fashionable word of the day. So we're, again, inclined to think that the moment that we're in is a singular moment. We've never seen technological change like this before. There have never been possibilities. Well, that's true like this before, but that's true and it also isn't true. The printing press was a marvelous innovation. It made it possible to mass produce books. And one might well have thought that with the invention of the printing press, the entire purpose of bringing people together, the transcribing of books, would become obsolete. That the simplest way to use this brilliant new technology to simplify college, to get rid of all the expense of bringing everyone together, would be to just send footmen out on horseback. I guess footmen weren't on horseback. Horseback riders on horseback with the books, and people could read them in their free time and be educated that way. But of course, that isn't how it played out. One might have thought the invention of television would have had exactly the same effect. I mean, imagine in the period after the Second World War to here, the disruptive innovation of having a box in almost every American home that could bring video and audio of, as we can see, extraordinary quality. How would that disrupt education? Well, of course, the printing press and the television are extraordinarily important in the development and the changes in American higher education at all levels and all places. In the 1950s, New York University had a brilliant idea, which came known as Sunrise Semester. And Sunrise Semester was an attempt to use this new medium of television and its ubiquity in the American home to bring an NYU education to everybody. And so they filmed real classes in a studio in New York City. I think the first one that was offered was Comparative Literature 10, from Stendhal to Hemingway. And the classes were beamed at about 6 in the morning on Saturday mornings to, even the first time it was offered, hundreds of thousands of households. And you could watch the course, you could write the papers, you could send them in, and for the princely sum of $70 or so, you could get credit. Now, what happened with Sunrise Semester? NYU still exists as a bricks and mortar institution, the first thing I will observe. It was an enormous success. It ran for a quarter of a century, it won an Emmy Award, it interrupted my watching of Gilligan's Island 20 years later, Saturday morning at 6 a.m. It brought intellectual engagement to people throughout the country who had no other way to get it. What it did not do was disrupt NYU, or replace NYU, or make NYU or any of our institutions obsolete. And I think there's an important lesson in there. I think it's important to think about why that might be as we think about the latest fashion, which are these massive open online courses, or MOOCs. And the numbers are actually very interestingly similar. So the first MOOCs that were offered, about 100,000 people followed them online, and a few hundred people actually completed them, much like in Sunrise Semester, where 100,000 people watched the first course online and 170 completed it. MOOCs have the opportunity to bring information in a sophisticated form to people all over the world who wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to do it. They're absolutely wonderful innovations, but they don't have the central piece that Jack Sawyer speaks to. Education is a social activity. It is something we do together as human beings. It is a part of our development as human beings, and as human beings, we are social creatures. We are relational. The deepest learning is not the transmission of information, whether it's by books or television or the internet. The deepest learning involves engagement, it involves back and forth, it involves people. And that's the reason that Sunrise Semester didn't replace NYU, and that's the reason that MOOCs are not going to replace Williams College. I would say that it's unfortunate that this very rich and interesting national conversation about technology and education, which has so many dimensions, has been reduced at the moment to whether or not it's interesting to educate 100,000 people at a time. Because even today, in today's talks we heard about ways in which technology can be brought to bear in fascinating, important ways into the education we deliver here, whether it's the Google Art collections, or whether it's iPad-enabled textbooks that have multimedia embedded in them. There are many ways in which technology will make what we do better, but teaching students 100,000 at a time isn't it. We're building a new Sawyer library, which I think speaks to this value. And so there's an existing Sawyer library, which was a wonderful library of its time. It stands there between the two new academic buildings, Hollander and Shapiro Halls. It has 396 individual carrels, and it has almost no group study space. The new Sawyer Library behind Stetson will be a marvelous building architecturally. In many ways, it's going to bring the Center for Media Initiatives, all our technology in education, together into the library with the rare books and with the not so rare books. Hundreds of seats for collaborative work, for interdisciplinary work. And that's what's great about the new Sawyer Library. And that, in fact, when one listens to Jack Sawyer talk about education, that a library built in 2013 should be named for Jack Sawyer couldn't be more fitting. So if the Sawyer Library exists fundamentally, as Williams College exists fundamentally, to create a community of students for the purpose of learning, it begs a question, which is who is going to make up that community?
America is the first country and society that has ever attempted to put as many as 30 to 40% of each age group on into higher education. This is a national decision rooted deep in our history and our philosophy and our conception of the purpose of American life. And it is out of this that the problem of numbers has come, and it is out of this dedication to it that I think we're going to find ways of meeting it.
So this is the birth of an aspiration for change. And it's actually gratifying to think that the aspirations of that time strike us as fairly modest compared to the aspirations that we have today. So in the 60s, 10% of American adults had a college degree. Now that number is more like 30%. And about 2/3 of Americans have had some college experience. So we've made enormous progress with respect to where we were in Sawyer's day. And I think we've talked today about the importance of continuing that progress. What's interesting to me about the way Sawyer frames this is he frames it not narrowly but broadly in terms of a national project to ensure access, grow access, and ensure access to higher education. And I think the question for Williams at that time, and I think still now, is what is our relationship to that national project? So what Sawyer implicitly rejects, what the college rejected in the 60s, was one possible road, which was to say that this business of access belongs to the universities of Texas, the big places, the big state schools. And we can merrily go along and educate a smaller social elite. And that's fine. Let that national project continue without us. And that's not the path that the college followed. It's not the path that we follow today. We are full participants in this national project of access to higher education. We have made it a core part of our mission to look around our society and ask the question, are we bringing people from every part of that society to Williams so that we are participating as a national duty, as a national commitment in that national project? Now, what happened to Williams as a result of that? We grew the student body by adding women from about 1,100 to 1,800 students. And we saw the start of the diversification of the student body along many lines: ethnic lines, racial lines, socioeconomic lines, religious lines, and international students. And this brings us to this question, this core question of who we're going to be, who we are. So here are a couple of statistics about who we are now that I think would have been seen as very ambitious in Jack Sawyer's day. So I'll start with one. 1/7 of our students, one of their parents went to Williams. So we have a deep connection to our multi-generational families. 1 student out of 7, neither of their parents graduated from college. So if you think about those two as two anchors to the Williams community, more than 1/3 of our students are domestic students of color. And more than half of our students are on financial aid. And I think this is a Williams that has changed dramatically. And one of our deepest commitments has to be to sustain that change and continue to seek out the diversity from without through our society, so that we continue to participate in this project. This is very expensive. This is the most expensive commitment that the college has ever made.
How much of a part does economics play in all this? Does the child of poor parents have as much of a chance at a good education as the child of wealthy parents?
I think the honest answer to that is no, he does not. There have been very substantial efforts in this direction, and the trend is a favorable one. A college like this has about nearly 25 to 27% of its students on scholarship help. The great state university systems, community colleges, junior colleges, the opportunities are opening up all the time. But for children from very poor families, I think there's no question that there is a handicap.
Well, I really appreciate Jack Sawyer's candor on that point, because it's something we all know to be true. Financial aid is the engine of access to Williams. Financial aid is the engine of access to Williams. And over the last decade, Williams has made an extraordinary commitment to financial aid. The financial aid budget has more than tripled over that time. And what that has enabled is the kind of socioeconomic diversity that I spoke about. I think it's important, though, to understand how that commitment fits into, how that investment fits into the economics of a college like Williams. And I'm not going to take you through a whole lot of numbers, but I'm going to give you some very round ones to think about. So at Williams, we spend about $90,000 per year to educate each student. That's all in. That's the classes, that's the food, that's the residence halls, that's the athletics, it's the arts, that's everything. That's not a number that has grown faster than inflation over the last 10 years. That number, you index that number to inflation, that's what we were spending 10 years ago. We charge a little less than $60,000 per year. That number has gone up faster than inflation. We collect, on the average, about $30,000. These are very rough, but about $30,000 per year once we net out financial aid. What this means is that even the student who is paying $60,000, paying the full cost of Williams, is getting a substantial subsidy. Where does that subsidy come from? The alumni. It comes from 200 years of building up an endowment, generously provided by an alumni. It comes from the alumni fund, generously provided by the alumni of today. Every student benefits from that subsidy. So don't misunderstand, no one should misunderstand that what our financial aid program does is take money from full-paying students in order to give it to those who need financial aid. Everybody is subsidized, but we do try to direct the help that that our endowment allows us to give towards those that need it the most. And I think it's very important that we understand financial aid and how that works in a deep way, because we all benefit. We are all financial aid students here at Williams, 100% of us. It does mean that it's expensive and that those expenditures compete with other things that we really need to do, hire faculty and keep the buildings going. And so as I look to the next decade and what are the things that we need to focus on in terms of resources for the college, among the very few highest priorities has to be to secure endowment to support this financial aid program. There is simply nothing more important than the nature of the student body that we have, the qualities of the student body that we have, and that is the only way to do it. But it isn't just about money. We can't do it only with money. It's not enough to bring students here from a society that is more stratified than I think it has been in 100 years and more diverse than it's been ever. And think that simply bringing students here and plopping them down and saying, welcome to Williams, go figure it out, is going to be an appropriate solution to the larger question of access and inclusion. There is a lot of work that doesn't involve writing checks, that involves working with students. It involves building programs that recognize that students who come from every corner of this country come with different sets of academic backgrounds and family backgrounds, and have had different opportunities to build some of the capacities that are going to be important to their success here. And our commitment has to be not just to bring those students here, but to help them to develop the capacities that they seize the opportunities they may not have had before now in order to fully succeed here and take full advantage of what we have to offer them. It is not simply the college operating in isolation. Right? We don't operate in isolation from our society. And the investments that we have to make are societal in scope.
If we look at it in a big perspective, the financing of this ought not to be beyond a republic as prosperous as today's America. What we're talking of is increasing the percentage going into higher education from roughly 1% of the gross national product to 2% of the gross national product. The estimates that are available suggest that that can provide the facilities, but what we have to keep our mind clearly on is the purposes of it all. We're ultimately concerned not with facilities but with people, with the growth of young men and women, and in that we must keep a very clear eye on the qualitative part of the problem to be sure we don't sacrifice essentials of quality before the onrush of quantity.
That tie between the quality of an education and the people engaged in it is the fundamental connection that underlies everything that we do at Williams, and I think everything that's important in higher education. People are expensive. Good people are really expensive. To hire them, to bring good students, that is an investment. And if we think about defending the liberal arts or making the case for the liberal arts, what we're making the case for is that investment. We're making the case for the investment in people that we've made here. So we have a 7-to-1 student-faculty ratio. Right? That's an extraordinary number. That number isn't important because it can decorate our view book or because it impresses U.S. News and World Report. That number is critical because of what it makes possible. That 7-to-1 student-faculty ratio makes possible every aspect of what we do that requires faculty time and attention on students. Tutorials. These are classes with one faculty member and 2 students, where the students, there's nowhere to hide in a tutorial, where the students are deeply engaged with each other in a way that's facilitated by that faculty member. Independent study work, all of that stuff that's not in the catalog that our students are studying every year because they go to a faculty member and say, I want to learn this thing, can you teach it to me? And they say, yeah, I can do that because I have a little bit of time to do that and I'm going to do that for you. Thesis work, research that goes on in laboratories, one-on-one with our faculty. The kinds of theses in the humanities and the social sciences that are supervised intensively by faculty. Small seminars, seminars of 8 to 10 or 12 students, rather than quasi-seminars of 25 or 30 students. These are the experiences that make the impact on our students' lives, and we have to invest in them. So we've asked this question in a slightly more rigorous way than you might know, about what it is that makes an impact on our students, the deepest impact in the things we care the most about. So if we stipulate that what our education really is about, more than anything else, is the capacity students learn to write, to express themselves orally, to think critically, that these are the things that they carry away from Williams that last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. If those are those things that we value, we can ask the question, what experiences do students have here that build those capacities? And one of the ways we ask that question is by surveying them. We give a survey at the end of the year to the graduating seniors, and we ask about a variety of their experiences here. And one proxy for how much their critical thinking skills or their writing skills have developed is to ask them, how much do you think your critical thinking skills and writing skills have developed? That's not a bad proxy on a population, right? In fact, the kids know whether they learn to write and whether they learn to think. But let's take it as a proxy for that. We can ask, what does self-reported gains in these areas correlate to in the other things you report that happen to you here at Williams, or that we know about you? So here are some things it doesn't correlate to. Self-reported gains in critical thinking and writing, oral expression, doesn't correlate to your GPA, doesn't correlate to your choice of major, doesn't matter what you major in, as long as you're engaged. Doesn't correlate to your race, doesn't correlate to your gender, doesn't correlate to whether you're an athlete or an artist, or whether one of your parents went to Williams, or whether neither of your parents went to college. It correlates to how much time you report having spent individually with faculty, inside or outside of the classroom. The thing we care about the most correlates uniquely to the thing we invest in the most deeply. This is not something that you can shortcut with a MOOC. This is not something you can replace in any way by teaching students 100,000 at a time. It's also not something that's unique to Williams. My own education took place not in an institution like Williams, the University of North Carolina, a wonderful institution much more like Texas. And if I look back on the experiences that I had classes of 250 and I had classes of 10. And if I look back on the experiences that mattered to me today, a quarter of a century later, it's those experiences in classes that were small seminars, individual work I did with faculty. And these, I think this is critical, that these are values that are not unique to the liberal arts college. The liberal arts ideal and the notion that the interaction of people is at the center of what we do is not unique to the liberal arts college. That is true of education. And it's true at Williams because it's true of education. But the opportunity that we have had here, that we have here and that we have to sustain, is to invest deeply in that. We have done so. And if I were going to put one thing up next to our commitment to financial aid over this next decade that we have to invest in deeply, it is the faculty. It is the sustaining of a great faculty, the hiring, the retention of a great and diverse faculty that can be brought into that sort of contact with this extraordinary student body. That's what it takes to have impact. It's what it takes to have impact on students, and through those students, it's what it takes to have impact on the world. And that impact is increasingly on our entire country and on our entire world.
I think the world and its problems are now more vividly before young people, and their sense of how to enter into it is more vivid. This is a generation, I think, I'm right in saying, newly aware of America's relationship with the rest of the world. Our basic educational legacy had come from Europe and was concerned really with Europe and its offshoots, the Atlantic community. This generation is aware that it's a wide world and they're interested in all of it.
So boy, did the world get smaller from 1964 to now. And our response to that has been profound. So if you look at what our students do today, large number of them spend some time studying abroad. We get our students out into the world. 8% of our students are now international, come from every corner of the world, and we very consciously, when we bring international students, do bring them from every continent and from many countries on those continents. And our curriculum has continued to evolve to reflect many kind of global perspectives. I think it's important to understand globalization and globalism not as a thing that sits over here as a part, so that's your globalization or your globalism program. It is a perspective that infuses every part of the curriculum, and we need to ensure it infuses the experience of every student here at Williams in ways that are in the curriculum and outside of the curriculum. I think the flexibility of the liberal arts provides us the opportunity to evolve to do this, and we have evolved to do this. And if you picked up the catalog and you were to look for the courses on the world, it's 2/3 of the courses, right? Because our faculty have taught in a more global way, and our students are interested in those courses. And so if you kind of put your finger on where's globalization at Williams, you can't find it because it is absolutely everywhere. And there's no doubt that continuing to sustain that aspect of what we do is going to be critical. It's going to be critical because our students have to graduate with a global perspective. They have to see themselves as living in the entire world and as agents of change in that entire world. And I think that the accumulation of a wide variety of perspectives is something that in the residential liberal arts context we're particularly in a good position to provide to our students. And that's partly globalization, but I think it's partly that aspect of diversity that complements the curricular and complements that aspect of our mission to bring students here from throughout our society, because we do that not only out of a sense that Williams ought to be accessible to people from throughout this country, but because the creation of a diverse community is critical to the education of every single student here. Because the development of a diversity of perspectives and an empathy for students who are more alien in their experience from the students who come here at the age of 18 who may be from one part of the country compared to another. The development of empathy across that divide is possibly the most important tool that we can give our students in the 4 years that they are here. If we want our students to make a difference, and again, the reason that we're here is that we want our students to make that difference in their communities and in the entire world.
I had an unusual opportunity to travel on a trip to Western Europe and the Soviet Union this November with a group of American business leaders organized by Time Incorporated. And in the course of that trip, which was extremely interesting, involved a long interview with Khrushchev and other leaders of European countries, a great many of these senior business executives said they found that the people best equipped for making the judgments and decisions and for making plans under conditions of changing circumstances, imperfect information, and so forth, were those who came from a liberal arts background, that at the higher levels of management, that capacity to judge, assess, coordinate, plan, and act under changing circumstances and conditions of great complexity was very well prepared for by the diffuse and wide-ranging liberal arts education.
Well, it is nice to have that external validation that in 1964, what we had been doing in the liberal arts in the previous decades had created leaders who were impressive to the folks at Time Incorporated. But I think that external perspective is critical for reinforcing to us within Williams the importance of a liberal arts education in producing leaders, which is kind of, in some sense, what we're fundamentally about. It's by producing leaders that we can have a disproportionate impact through our relatively small number of graduates on our communities, and our states, and on our country, and on the world. It's not only an opportunity, it's a responsibility. As well-resourced as this institution is after 200 years of generosity from alumni, it is a responsibility to leverage that opportunity to have a disproportionate impact in the world with the students that we educate. And we do that in the end by producing students who can adapt to change. Students, as Sawyer says, who have the fluidity to change what their perspectives are and to learn new things about what they need in order to lead, who can deal with complexity and can deal with ambiguity and collaborate with those whose experiences may be very different from their own. I wish I could produce a beautiful chart full of numbers that would prove to you that our students have had, over the last century, disproportionate impact in this way. I can't. I can't do better than that wonderful chart that Professor Devidas showed about where our students wind up. But there are other kinds of evidence other than just numbers. And there's anecdotes. And I think that the anecdotal evidence of our alumni is extraordinarily powerful. To meet them, to talk to them, I certainly spend a lot of time, some of my most gratifying time, doing. So I could now give you another hour of lists of alumni and their extraordinary accomplishments. I'm going to spare you that. But let me pull two where I think are worth meditating on for a moment, just from the list of people that we happen to have honored with honorary degrees or bicentennial medals in the last couple of years. So one of them is Toby Cosgrove from the class of 1962. So the first part of his career, Toby Cosgrove was the best heart surgeon in the world. And that's a pretty extraordinary thing to do. You might think that was enough for a career. But he took a shift and then became the CEO of the Cleveland Clinic, one of the most extraordinary kind of health systems in this country. And in moving to being the CEO of the Cleveland Clinic, he brought to healthcare and the way they operate healthcare a kind of focus on validated best practices in patient outcomes. That is the study of what really makes a difference in patient outcomes and a rigorous application of that work to the work that the Cleveland Clinic does. And the underlying goal is to shift from a model of disease management to a model of healthcare. And it'd be hard to imagine an institution that has had more impact than the Cleveland Clinic on the way we think about the provision of healthcare in this country. So I think Toby Cosgrove saw the same healthcare system everybody else saw, but thought something very different about it. A second example, Bethany McLean, class of 1992. So Bethany came here as a math and English major. And after a stint on Wall Street, became a journalist. And she was the first person to notice that Enron, if you took a good look at Enron's books, they didn't show the same picture that the Enron executives were painting in what they were saying about the company. And so she was the first to notice the problems there, and she wrote the definitive book, The Smartest Guys in the Room, about the fall of Enron. She then continued her career in financial journalism and has written extraordinarily insightful pieces about and books about the recent financial crisis. The point I want to make about Bethany McLean is she looked at the same data that everyone else was looking at, and she saw something different. She adapted to change. Both she and Toby Cosgrove adapted to change in themselves, in their careers, and in the world that they were examining. Jack Sawyer looked at the same Williams that his predecessor had looked at, and he saw something different. He was a Williams grad. And I think this weekend has been about apprehending, contemplating change at Williams in that spirit. You know, how can we look at the same Williams that everyone else is looking at, and yet when we need to, see something different? So Jack Sawyer dared to change Williams. You know, we chose the name for this weekend advisedly. He dared when he needed to be bold, to do things that might look difficult, although as we learned, he never did them heedlessly. He never did them thoughtlessly. He dared to have inclusive processes. He dared to bring others into the conversation. He was never afraid that if the conversation grew too large, that he would lose control of it. So he dared to be inclusive in the way he brought about change. But he also dared to be firmly committed to the fundamental values of this institution. He dared to defend the liberal arts. And he dared to be resistant to the fads and the fashions of the time when he thought that that was what this institution needed. What was today about? Well, here's what it wasn't about. It wasn't about kicking off a commission to carve out a 10, 20, 50-year plan for Williams. That's not what Jack Sawyer did when he arrived. It's not what I think we as a community need to do. What today has been about has been an opportunity to imagine our future together, to think about aspects of that future, to dream some dreams, to challenge ourselves and to challenge each other, to think about that balance, that nuanced balance between the ways we must change who we are in order to stay who we more deeply are. So we have to dare to imagine that future. We have to dare to think big things, big thoughts, dare to imagine that our students will continue to be different or to think about themselves differently, dare to imagine that we may want them to have different experiences when they're here than they have had in the past. But we're also going to dare to defend Mark Hopkins on one end of a log and a student on the other. Dare to defend that as the core value that has underlain for more than a century what a Williams education, what a liberal arts education is fundamentally about. And we're going to dare to stand up for that as well. In the end, we have to dare to remain true to our mission in a world that is spinning rapidly. And that's a mission is to simply to cultivate the citizens of this century to come, whose world we must admit that we can now only barely begin to comprehend. And the fundamental task before all of us now, in light of that enduring mission, is to envision and then create the Williams that is responsive to that vision. The Williams that is going to be right for and fully relevant to the present and to the future age to come. So I'm looking forward to continuing this ongoing and fundamental conversation with all of you and within our entire community. And thank you for participating in this weekend's events. And thank you for caring so much about Williams.